It was supposed to be a quick errand. I just wanted a quote on a pocket watch my late husband, Walter, had repaired decades ago. The pawn shop on Main Street smelled like old metal, sweat, and stale cigar smoke. Behind the scratched glass counter stood a thick man with a shiny bald head and gold rings on 3 fingers. His name, according to the grimy plastic tag on his shirt, was Mr. Boris. I placed the watch on the counter, and he appraised it with a bored look. When he gave me a lowball offer, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the watch. That's when he moved. He suddenly grabbed my wrist, his thick fingers squeezing my thin skin. "Come on, lady," he smirked, his voice oily. "Just sell it. You're too old to need something this fancy." His grip tightened, and I winced. "Your husband's gone. Let the dead go." My entire body went still. The air left my lungs, and the shop's dusty silence seemed to roar in my ears. The trembling in my hand stopped, not from fear, but from a sudden, cold fury. I looked him dead in the eye and whispered, "You just made a very expensive mistake." I took my watch and left, my cane tapping sharply on the cracked pavement. That watch was not ordinary. It wasn't some trinket he could bully me out of. Walter, my Walter, had built it himself during his years as a Navy engineer. He used specialized parts from a decommissioned submarine timer, parts he said were made to withstand impossible pressure. It was his masterpiece, a blend of his skill and his soul. Inside the back casing, hidden from view, he had etched a tiny, perfect engraving. "Time belongs to no man." To a man like Mr. Boris, it was just old brass and gears, worth maybe $50. To me, it was priceless. It was the last thing Walter's hands had made. The pawn shop owner had treated it like junk, and he had put his hands on me to take it. He had mistaken my white hair and my quiet life for weakness. That night, I didn't listen to Walter's jazz records. Instead, I opened his old, heavy toolbox in the garage. The smell of oil and steel filled the air. I stared at the engraving tools he once used, their wooden handles smooth from his grip, and I smiled faintly in the dim light. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and Walter's watch. The sunlight streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had intended to clean the watch, to wipe away the memory of Mr. Boris's greasy counter. I picked up my softest polishing cloth and tilted the watch to the light. My breath caught. There, on the smooth backplate, was a fine, deep scratch, right near the hinge where Walter's engraving was hidden. It wasn't there yesterday. My chest tightened. He had tried to pry it open. He had tampered with it, probably right after I left, thinking I was just a forgetful old woman. But Walter had been clever. He didn't just hide the engraving. He had also hidden a small, secondary serial plate inside, one that I knew traced back to classified engineering prototypes from his time in the service. It was a fail-safe, he called it. If that greedy man had succeeded in opening it and tried to sell the parts, that serial number would alert the official Navy database. He had no idea what he was holding. My hands were steady as I got dressed. I chose my Sunday coat, the dark blue one, and walked back to the shop, my cane tapping a firm rhythm on the tile. The bell above the door tinkled, announcing my arrival. The same man, Mr. Boris, was there, leaning on the counter and reading a racing form. He looked up, and his smug expression returned when he saw me. "Changed your mind, sweetheart?" he asked, folding his paper. "Decided to take the cash?" I gave him the sweetest smile I could manage, the kind I saved for garden club members I didn't like. "Oh no, dear," I said, my voice light. "I was just checking if my watch has been reported stolen yet." His smirk faltered. His eyes narrowed, confusion clouding his face. "What are you talking about, old woman?" I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I glanced deliberately up at the small, black security camera mounted in the corner above his head. I looked back at him and said, "You should really check your footage from yesterday. You seem to have a problem with damaging customer property." That afternoon, I went to the local police station. The officer at the desk looked tired and barely listened as I began my story. I filed a quiet report detailing the incident. I included the physical assault, rolling up my sleeve to show the faint, purplish bruises his fingers had left on my wrist. I gave a detailed statement about his aggressive behavior and the damage to my property. The officer looked skeptical, typing slowly with 2 fingers. "Ma'am, it's a pawn shop. These things get heated." He was dismissing me. That's when I mentioned the watch's origins. "The watch contains a serial number, officer," I said calmly, "one linked to a decommissioned naval prototype." Suddenly, the man stopped typing and sat up straight. "A Navy connection? You said the watch was tampered with." I nodded, watching his expression change from boredom to sharp interest. He started taking notes very fast. The officer promised to look into it, but I didn't trust waiting for a bureaucracy to move. I knew I needed to call in a favor. Walter had served for 30 years. His closest friend from that time was Commander Lewis, a man who was now a retired Navy liaison living just a few towns over. We hadn't spoken in months, but our bond was forged in shared years of service and loss. I baked an apple pie, Walter's favorite recipe, and drove to his home. We sat in his study, surrounded by naval history books, pretending to reminisce over tea. I talked about my garden and he talked about his grandchildren. Then, in a pause, I slipped the watch onto the polished mahogany table between us. The scratch gleamed. "It's been mishandled, Arthur," I whispered. "By a pawnbroker who put his hands on me." Arthur Lewis picked up the watch. His eyes, usually so kind, darkened as he examined the serial plate with a desk magnifier. "Martha," he said, his voice low and hard, "that serial shouldn't even exist anymore. This is restricted issue hardware." He looked up at me, the old commander back in his eyes. He offered to pull the pawn shop's surveillance logs through a contact in state security. 2 days later, Arthur called me back to his study. He had the footage. His contact had pulled the entire day's logs from the shop server. We watched it on his large computer monitor. The video was clear, and the audio was sharp enough to hear every word. We saw me at the counter, saw Mr. Boris's smug face, and then saw him lunge and grab my wrist. I watched myself wince, and a fresh wave of cold anger washed over me. But that wasn't the worst part. The timestamp jumped forward 2 hours, long after I had left. The closed sign was on the door. The footage showed Mr. Boris alone, prying at my watch with a small screwdriver, cursing loudly when he couldn't get the case open. "That's tampering with restricted property," Arthur muttered, his jaw tight. He was trying to access the internal mechanism. I just sipped the tea he had given me, my hand perfectly steady. I looked at my old friend and asked, very calmly, "How public can we make this?" Arthur knew exactly what to do. The footage, edited to show the assault and the after-hours tampering, was leaked anonymously to a popular local veterans forum. It was posted with a simple title, "Local Shop Owner Disrespects Navy Widow and Her Husband's Service Relic." Within hours, the comments exploded. The community was outraged. "He disrespected a widow's service relic?" one user wrote. "He put his hands on her?" Then other stories began to surface. "He's done this before. He told my father his service pistol was a replica. He offered me $20 for my wife's heirloom." The stories poured in, all painting the same picture of a man who cheated and humiliated the vulnerable. One comment, buried deep in the thread, made my blood run cold. It was from a man whose grandfather's World War II medal, a Silver Star, had been lost by that same shop. It had never made it home after an appraisal. I spent the next 3 days glued to my computer. I began cross-referencing the names and items mentioned in the forum with the pawn shop's online listings and known reseller sites. My heart chilled when I found it. There, on a high-end auction website, was the World War II Silver Star, listed by a third-party seller I had never heard of. But the description matched perfectly, right down to the unique engraving on the back mentioned by the grandson. Mr. Boris had been flipping stolen or underpriced items from veterans and widows, selling them through a hidden network for a massive profit. He wasn't just a bully, he was a predator. I printed every listing. I documented every connection. I went to the store and bought a new 3-ring binder and a pack of dividers. With a black marker, I wrote on the cover in neat, block letters, "Operation Justice." I felt a grim satisfaction. This was no longer just about my wrist or my watch. This was for all of them. My research uncovered something far larger than one greedy man in a dusty shop. As I dug into the business licenses and tax filings for Mr. Boris's store, I found it was linked to a single shell company. This company, in turn, owned 3 other small pawn shops in neighboring counties. The registered agent for all of them was the same accountant, and the secondary contact was Mr. Boris's cousin. It was an organized racket disguised as neighborhood trade, a spider's web with my Mr. Boris at the center. They preyed specifically on the vulnerable. War widows like me, the elderly sorting through a lifetime of possessions, and young people who didn't know the true value of what they had. As I dug deeper into the shell company's filings, I found the name of their insurance provider. It was a small, obscure firm. On a hunch, I realized they were all insured under the same fraudulent claim group, likely reporting valuable items as damaged or stolen, while selling them secretly. This insurance angle was the key. I couldn't just accuse them. I needed them to expose themselves. I practiced a new voice, one that was slightly shaky, a little breathy, portraying a wealthy but nervous buyer. I called the insurance firm, claiming I was interested in purchasing several high-value military collectibles from a private seller and needed to verify their authenticity and insurance status. The agent on the other end was polite but clinical. He asked for any serial numbers I had. I gave him 2 from the online auction site, which he confirmed were in good standing. Then I took a breath. "Oh, and there's one more," I said, as if I'd just remembered it. "It's an old naval timer prototype." I read him the serial number from Walter's watch. The line went completely silent. I could hear the faint sound of typing, then a sharp click. "Ma'am," the agent said, his voice suddenly rigid and official. "Where did you see that number?" "That item is on our flag list. It was reported as missing from secured inventory 5 years ago." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. It all clicked into place. The watch wasn't just a prototype Walter built. It was built from prototype parts that had been reported as missing or stolen from the Navy long before they ever got to him. He likely acquired them as scrap, not knowing their status. But the pawn ring knew. Their insurance had flagged that serial. This meant they weren't just flipping heirlooms. They were laundering stolen government property through fake resale certificates. My late husband's watch, the one Mr. Boris had dismissed as junk, had accidentally tied his entire ring to a federal-level offense. He hadn't just insulted a widow, he had poked a sleeping bear. This was poetic justice. It wasn't just personal revenge anymore. It was about dismantling his entire web of lies. I closed my binder. I knew what I had to do next. I decided to bait them again, but this time, I would be the one setting the trap. I went to an estate sale across town and found the perfect item. A heavy, intricate antique brooch. It looked like something an old woman would cherish, but its gold content alone made it worth over $2,000. Back home, I carefully used Walter's tools to pry open a small decorative backing. I inserted a tiny, button-sized GPS tracker I had ordered online and sealed it perfectly. No one would ever know. The next day, I walked back into the pawn shop. Mr. Boris was there, and his face soured when he saw me. "What now?" he snapped. I put on my most frail, hesitant expression. I'm so sorry about before," I stammered, holding out the brooch. "I need money for a medical bill. This was my mother's. Is it worth anything?" His eyes lit up with that familiar, predatory greed. He barely looked at it. "It's plated. Costume jewelry," he lied. "I'll give you $80 for it." "Oh," I said, pretending to be crushed. "Well, let me think about it." I left the shop, leaving the bait on his counter. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, the small handheld receiver for the tracker began to ping. The brooch wasn't in his shop. It wasn't even in town. The signal was coming from a locked warehouse unit in an industrial park just outside the county line. I drove there in my old, reliable sedan, parking on a dirt road by the roadside, hidden by a small grove of trees. I pulled out Walter's old birdwatching binoculars. The warehouse was gray and nondescript. For an hour, I watched. A van marked Estate Clearance Services pulled up. Men started unloading boxes, hundreds of them, all labeled with small pawn tags from Mr. Boris's shop and the others in his network. This was his hub. This was where he stored the real valuables before shipping them to auction houses or private buyers. I steadied my hands, held the binoculars to my phone's camera lens, and took photos. I zoomed in on the van's license plate, on the men's faces on the boxes. Then I sent everything to Commander Lewis. Commander Lewis moved fast. He contacted his old Navy contacts and a state investigator he trusted, a sharp woman named Kale. They met at his house, and this time, I wasn't just a grieving widow. I was their primary witness. My binder, Operation Justice, was their blueprint. My photos and the GPS data were their undeniable proof. They planned a quiet sting operation to catch the pawn network red-handed during their next big shipment. I insisted on being there. Arthur tried to argue, telling me it was too dangerous. I set my teacup down with a firm click. Mr. Boris laid his hands on me. He tried to steal my husband's memory. I said, my voice low and steady, I will be there to watch him fall. The investigator, Kale, studied my face for a long moment and then nodded. She's in the van, Kale said. The sting was set for Friday night. The same time their logs showed Mr. Boris was due to meet a high-value buyer at the warehouse. From the cramped darkness of the surveillance van, I watched. The air crackled with static from the team's radios, and the van smelled of stale coffee and adrenaline. I held my breath, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. Then, just as the tracker predicted, Mr. Boris's car pulled up, followed by the estate clearance van. He got out and began to unload boxes, handing them to a man in an expensive suit. He was so arrogant, so confident in his little empire. He handed an envelope, likely full of cash, to the man in the suit. That's the buyer, Kale whispered beside me.
Now.
Just then, the night exploded. Floodlights turned the dark lot into day, and officers swarmed the area. State police. Hands in the air. Boris froze mid-breath, the envelope still in his hand. The buyer dropped his boxes and fell to his knees. An officer went straight to the box Boris was holding. Sir, we found the restricted items, the officer called out. The Naval Watch is here. Mr. Boris began to shout, his face purple under the flashing lights. He claimed innocence, pointing at his cousin, blaming his employees, saying he'd been set up. It wasn't me. I didn't know, he screamed, his voice cracking with pathetic terror. Investigator Kale opened the van door and nodded at me. I stepped out into the cold night air, my cane steady on the asphalt. All the noise seemed to stop as I approached. Mr. Boris's shouting died in his throat as he saw me. His eyes went wide, like he was looking at a ghost. I stood 10 feet from him and looked him right in the eye. You told me to sell my husband's memory, I said, my voice soft but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Now you'll sell your freedom. The officers cuffed him, and he stared at me, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. They led him to the car, but as I stood there, I knew it wasn't over yet. The head of the snake was caught, but the body was still writhing. The news spread like wildfire. The local station led with, local pawn ring exposed in veteran theft scandal. The story of a network preying on the elderly and military families was explosive. That veterans forum lit up, with people cheering. Once the police set up a tip line, more victims came forward, emboldened by the arrest. They brought receipts, photos, and stories that confirmed everything in my binder. The entire operation began to collapse. One by one, the other shops were raided and shut down. Each manager and the crooked accountant were brought in for questioning. The house of cards I had so carefully watched finally came tumbling down. The day after the raid, a young journalist, the same one from the Veterans Forum leak, knocked on my door. He looked earnest and respectful. Ma'am, he said, holding his reporter's pad. My editor heard you were the one who started it all. Can I get a comment? I invited the young man, Paul, into my living room. I served him tea, but I made my terms clear. I would not be named, and my face would not be shown. I am just a widow, I told him, who believes in honor.
He asked me what I thought about the arrest.
I thought for a moment, staring at a photo of Walter on the mantel. Some men, I said softly, mistake silence for weakness. They see gray hair and a quiet house and assume the person inside is finished. They are wrong. That quote was the one the newspaper used. It went viral. People started calling the mysterious source the Widow Avenger. The story was picked up by national news blogs. The public loved the idea of a quiet grandmother taking down a criminal ring. A few days later, a letter arrived, postmarked from the county jail. It was from Mr. Boris. I set it on my hall table, unopened. He could wait. I finally opened his letter a week later, after I'd made an important phone call. His words were pitiful. He didn't apologize for grabbing me. He didn't apologize for stealing from veterans. He blamed greed. He blamed his cousin. He claimed ignorance. And then, the real reason for the letter. "You cost me everything," he wrote in a desperate scrawl. "My shop, my family.
You ruined me."
I smiled faintly, a cold, thin smile that didn't reach my eyes. "No," I whispered to the letter. "You did." I tore it into 4 perfect squares and threw it in the trash. The phone call I had made was to Commander Lewis. With his help, I arranged for all the recovered relics, the medals, the service weapons, the folded flags, to be donated to the State Veterans Museum. They would be returned to their families or, if the families couldn't be found, displayed with the honor they deserved. All of them, that is, except one. The dedication ceremony at the museum was small but beautiful. My husband's watch, the one that started it all, sat in a velvet-lined glass case. It was polished and gleaming. Below it, a small brass plaque read, "For Walter Ellison, whose time still teaches us honor." Commander Lewis gave a speech, and a small crowd of veterans and their families clapped as I stood beside the display. For the first time in a long time, the tears that shone in my eyes were not of grief, but of pride. Walter's legacy wasn't just in a box in my garage. It was here, teaching a new generation. As the reception wound down, I saw a familiar figure waiting for me by the exit. It was Paul, the young reporter. He wasn't holding a notepad this time. He was holding a thick manila envelope, and his expression was grave. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "I think you need to see this. It's not over." I stepped outside with Paul, under the museum's stone arches. Inside the envelope were documents, bank statements, wire transfers, offshore account numbers. A whistleblower from the Shell Company's accounting firm had contacted him after the first story broke. Mr. Boris and his partners hadn't just been making thousands. They had been hiding millions in stolen funds in uninsured, untraceable accounts overseas. The money from the auctions, the laundered government funds, it was all there. "He hid millions, ma'am," Paul said, his voice quiet. "The state can't touch it without international help, and they won't act unless there's massive public pressure. We can expose everything, if you're willing to share your full story." I hesitated. I had my justice. Walter's watch was safe. Was it enough? Then I saw Walter's inscription in my mind, the words he etched so carefully. "Time belongs to no man." That money didn't belong to Mr. Boris, either. I looked at Paul and nodded. I agreed to a full, on-camera interview, though my face was kept in silhouette. The exposé aired a week later on the national news. It was titled, "The Widow Who Brought Down a Pawn Empire." I told them everything. I told them about the grab, the threat, the binder, the tracker, and the web of lies. But this time, Paul aired the proof of the hidden accounts. The public outrage was immediate and immense. It was no longer a local story. It was an international scandal. Under pressure, and with the evidence I had provided, the federal government was forced to act. They began proceedings with the foreign banks. Every offshore account was frozen. The entire network, from the top down, was shattered, and the money was seized. A few days later, I received a quiet, formal phone call. It was from the Attorney General's office, thanking me personally for my service. They said I had done the country a great service. With the settlement money from the seized assets, the state set up a victims' compensation fund. They asked me to help administer it, but I had a better idea. I used the seed money to found the Ellison Fund. a nonprofit charity dedicated to helping elderly victims of financial abuse and fraud. We provided legal aid, financial counseling, and a voice for those who, like me, were mistaken for being weak. I rented a small office on Main Street, just 2 blocks from where Mr. Boris's shop used to be. Young law students and retired accountants, inspired by the Widow Avenger story, began to pour in as volunteers. Walter would have loved that. The museum, as a thank you, had a perfect replica of my husband's watch made for me. It was beautiful. I kept the original in the museum, but the replica I placed on my nightstand, its soft ticking a comfort in the quiet house. One evening, nearly a year later, I sat by my living room window, watching the first snow of the season fall. Walter's favorite jazz record played softly. The faint, steady ticking of the replica watch echoed from the bedroom. It was a sound of peace now, a sound of order restored, not of time running out. I thought of the man who had started it all. Sell my husband's watch, I murmured to the empty room, remembering his greasy smirk and iron grip. My lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. I'd sooner sell my soul. I turned off the lamp, and the room went dark, save for the blue-white light of the snow outside. The watch gleamed on the nightstand, proof that some things and some women can never be bought or bullied. And somewhere in a cold federal prison cell, a pawnshop owner named Boris still flinched and broke into a cold sweat whenever he heard the simple, steady sound of a ticking clock.